All right. Now, let's go ahead and jump into black and white from here. I'll go ahead and click on it in the top right-hand corner, and it's going to transfer me over. Now, the first thing that I want to go through really quick is understanding what clipping masks are. Up in the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's something called the navigator. And this is where you have the ability to adjust the view of your entire photo. And most programs are going to have something like a navigator, so you guys probably know what it is, but you can click and choose how close you'd like to zoom in. I shrunk this photo down a little bit so it's a bit easier to work with as we do a lot of heavy editing, so it's not going to be an enormous file, but you get the idea. So let me go ahead and click on Fit. Now, next to the navigator, you have a loop where you can scroll your mouse over parts of the photo and you can view it at a set amount of zoom. And we're going to go ahead and choose the histogram. Now, this is the distribution of blacks, midtones, and highlights in your photo, as represented by this strange little histogram. Now, this one is going to look very different because I took this photo as not as a complete silhouette, but as very close to a silhouette. So the sun was shining from behind the model. The lake has that really nice bright halo behind him, and then you have this really beautiful silhouette that goes around, but you can still see a couple of those small details. So on the left-hand side of the histogram, this is the section that shows you the amount of shadows or darker midtones that are in your image. You'll see we have a lot of shadows and darks. We've got some big black areas in the top right-hand corner there that are almost completely blown out. He's almost entirely in shadow, as well as the top left-hand corner there. Now, on the right-hand side of the histogram, this is represented by the highlights. And there aren't quite as many as the shadows. There's this bright highlight behind him, and then everything just seems to kind of fade into midtones and then black. Now, to view the clipping mask, there are these little triangles on the top right-hand and left-hand corners. And when you click on them, it will show this pixel map on top of your photo. Anywhere that you see red is indicated that those are blown out highlights. Anywhere that you see blue, those are really, really dark black shadows. That means that there is no information in any of those areas. One of the reasons why people use clipping masks is to be able to make sure that they don't have any spots in their photo that are left out. Some people are really specific about this. They don't like to have areas that are blown out, or they don't like to have blacks. They like to make sure that everything is pushed in a little bit so that you have all of that detail that you shot your image at. Some people like to access the clipping mask because they like to make sure that they're not cutting out, for instance, excess information in the subject, but maybe some of the areas in the corners of the photo are okay if you drop them out. Now, let's go ahead and watch what happens when we move our whites and our black sliders. When we take the white slider and move it over to the right, the further I push it, the more that red grows. It grows out, 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 out. And when I turn that clipping mask off, you'll see that that whole section behind the subject is just completely blown out at this point. Now, as I move this down to the left, it will slowly start to shrink. And if I drop that whites all the way down to 0, you'll see, despite the fact that it's very faint, there's just a little tiny bit of information behind him. Now, what I like to do is have just a few highlights and shadows that are a little overdone. I like high contrast. It's one of my personal preferences. And I like to have a lot of blacks and a lot of like really intense whites. Again, some people are very different in this sense, and they like to make sure that there are no areas that are being clipped or, lost information in their entire photo. Now, we're going to do the same for the blacks. You'll see as I move it over to the right, it's going to create almost an entire silhouette of him as a person. And we'll go ahead and turn the clipping mask off, and you'll see he's almost completely in shadow, and now it's almost like I have him in just this black haze, as well as the corners up on the top, and then the background area is still a little bit of detail, but not quite. Go ahead and turn that clipping mask back on, and I'm going to move it down just enough so that the corners are a little dark, maybe down at the bottom is dark, but we're not losing too much information. So we're just turning that on and off very quickly. The clipping mask can be completely useful. Other people don't ever bother with it. It's one of those things that's good to see, but is not necessarily the most useful for others. Now, alongside the histogram, there's also an info pane, just in case you ever wanted to know it was there. This shows you all of the information that goes along with this image. So what it was shot on, what type of photo it is, it's a PSD file. You can see focal length, ISO, you can see capture date and time, all that fun stuff. So this was taken on November 2nd last year. It was taken at 4:56 p.m., just in case you ever needed to know that either. So just in case you ever need to access that, that info pane is over there on the top right-hand corner. A lot of times when I'm doing heavy editing, I turn this entire pane off because then I can see more information on the right-hand side and I can do more editing. Now, one of the other things here inside black and white that's also really useful to know is the ability to view the zones of your image. And this is a posterized version of the tonal distribution in your image. There's a drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. It's set to after, which means that we're taking a look at our after image right now. This is our final photo as we continue to edit it. You can take a look at your before image. This is your original photo, as well as the zones. When you choose zones, again, it is this kind of strange posterized look at your photo, and it separates it down into all of the different tones in each section of your image. So we can zoom in, and we'll take a look right up by the subject's face. And you'll see for the most part, the tones on his face are pretty similar because, again, he's for the most part in shadow. So it's these very, very dark tones speckled with a little bit of lighter midtones, but for the most part, it is quite a bit darker. A lot of people like to have access to the zone system so that they can see it as they're editing. They like to be able to make sure that, for instance, when they're working on a portrait, they have a nice distribution of tones in the face. And by viewing the zone system, they can check and see it in more of that graphic way, and it can be a little bit easier to edit the image. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's always one of those things that I like to point out so that you know that it exists if you want to have access to it. Let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and swap that back over to after. Now, one of the other things here that is always really good to know about is in the color response pane. And there's something called filter presets. Back in the days of the black and white darkroom, when you used to shoot the film, you could apply a color glass filter to your lens as you were shooting, and it would adjust how the colors were tonally. They would adjust the tones of the colors that were coming through. So despite the fact that the image is black and white, you know that when you're looking at that image, the sky is most likely blue. These color filters would adjust the tones of each color. For instance, the red filter that you'll see over on the right-hand side, the red filter made a lot of blues and aquas darker. A lot of landscape photographers used red-ish filters on their images so that the skies would get really dark and really intense, and it made it look kind of stormy and cloudy and cool. When you click on any of these different filter presets, it's going to readjust the color response pane. So we can click on the red filter, and you'll see it's going to lighten all of the reds and darken all of the blues. We could click on the green filter, which is going to darken most of the reds. We also have an infrared preset, which is going to do some very strange things to the image. It doesn't work quite as well for this photo. It really, really blacks out all of the reds and the magentas, but it lightens all of the yellows and the greens. So it can create these very strange black and white images. So you can play around with which preset is going to work best for your images. The filter presets are, for the most part, fun. They're meant to play around with. If you used to be a darkroom photographer and you like to use presets, you can select the ones that you really liked to use. A lot of people find them a little strange and a little hard to work with. So I always suggest going for the red preset because it's one of the ones that most people tend to like to use the best. It works really well for images that have blue skies that you want to darken and intensify, and it works well if you have images where you want to lighten up a lot of the warmer reds and yellows in the photo. And a lot of times that's most landscape images. You want to lighten up all of the foliage and you want to darken all of those bluer areas. Now, the next thing that I want to introduce you to here is the selective color options. We talked earlier about the fact that the image that you're looking at is technically a black and white layer on top of a color photo. So that color layer is beneath this new black and white layer, and we can selectively choose which parts of the photo we want to remain in color. The ability to adjust the entire photo globally is adjusted by using the blending pane. Now, let me go through and we're going to close out all of these different panes so that you can see it. The blending pane is all the way down at the bottom of the adjustments on the right-hand side. And for the most part, people don't ever know that this exists. This is just like the blending options and opacity sliders that you have in any layered-based workflow. So in the layers program, you're going to have access to blending modes and opacity. In the effects program, you're going to have options like changing the blending mode and changing the layer opacity. Same idea here. You can change the blending mode of the black and white layer. By doing so, you can create some really cool photographic techniques. Sometimes you can get these kind of ethereal options here. So by selecting the lighten, it kind of decreases the intensity of everything and adds this kind of soft pastel hue. We can go through and we can change it to things like soft light and overlay, which add this really high contrast, high saturated, intense look. One of the ones that a lot of people use is luminosity. This just affects the tones in the image and leaves everything else alone. Now, one of the other things that you can do is if you want to create kind of an almost black and white look, you can take the opacity slider and move it over to the left. And as you drop it down, you're going to get a little bit of the color information coming back through, but you can still play around with editing the black and white style of the image. Now, if you want to bring back selective color, that's when you're going to use the selective color brush, which looks just like a little masking brush that you would have access to in other programs. It works just the same way as well. You have all of your options up at the top. We're going to make sure our mode is set to paint out. We want to remove the black and white and reveal the color beneath it. We've got our size, our feathering amount. We have our opacity. I'm going to pull that all the way up to 100 so you can see it work. And then we also have the perfect brush, which is our edge detection brush. Now let's go through and we're going to paint over his form here so we can bring back all of the color information from his red jacket. I'm going to bring all of his color back and we're going to leave that background completely in black and white. Now, I'm not going to go through and paint him entirely out, but if you're going through and you are painting in and out this whole section here and you're removing all of it, we're going to go through and we're going to paint out some of these other stranger areas here in the top right-hand corner. When you're working with any of these different tools, I'm creating a really, really basic mask here and just running through. I usually use a tablet when I'm doing this. I don't have one attached today, and that tends to make a lot of these changes go quite a bit quicker. I think that using a tablet when you're doing large amounts of brush changes and masking, it's going to make your life so much easier. Anytime that you use a brush tool of any sort, you can actually view the mask of that brush. So let's go through and we're going to go to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen where we saw that zones section, and that's where the before and after can be selected. And you'll see now that I have that brush chosen, I can select how I'd like to view my mask. So I'll select mask red. Anywhere that has that red overlay is being brought back into Technicolor. Anywhere that you can see the black and white is being left completely alone. So if you go overboard, for instance, you'll see there's this weird little strip right up at the top that I accidentally painted over. I can change my mode over to paint in and just paint that black and white back in. And I can do this across the board. So I accidentally added those leaves. I didn't accidentally do it, but you get the idea. If you make any adjustments that you didn't want, you can go through and you can paint them back out. I love being able to view my mask because I think that it's really helpful when you're doing an intricate mask like this one. This isn't necessarily the easiest thing to mask out. He has a lot of very strange, harsh edges along his blazer. I want to make sure that I get all of those little tiny spots on his face and along his hairline. And I want to make sure that it is really, really good because when you're separating black and white from color, it's going to be very obvious. Now, I want to also show you these little keyboard shortcuts that are going to save you a lot of time. When you're making a mask like this and you're going through and you're working really hard, all of these little spots keep accidentally getting overdone. If you click the X key on your keyboard, watch the mode in the tool options bar. It swaps from paint in to paint out. This is really, really useful when you're doing editing like this because I want to be able to go back and forth so that if I make mistakes, I can click that X key and I can paint, or I can click that X key and I can remove. Back and forth until it ends up working for me. So that X key is going to save you a lot of time. The other thing that's really nice is if you click the left and right bracket keys on your keyboard, you can adjust the size of your brush. So when you're going between small little intricate details or very large areas that you need to remove, being able to change the size of your brush quickly is also going to save you a lot of time. Now let's go ahead and let's swap this so we can see our original photo again. We want to be able to take a look at our handiwork. So I'm going to go back down to that left-hand side drop-down menu. And we're going to go ahead and change this to after. And now we can see that I have him completely in color and I have my background still in black and white. If you make any changes with any of the brush tools, you have an invert and a reset button in the top right-hand corner. So if I click invert, it's going to swap it so that the background is color and he is black and white. You can also click the reset and it will start you back from scratch. If you make any changes that you don't like, you can press the Control or Command Z button. So if I click reset color and I go, oh my gosh, holy cow, I can't believe I just did that, press Control or Command Z and it will back you up a step. If you make a change that you don't really like, so I made this brush stroke, it looks really bad, I don't like it, you can also press Control or Command Z. Let's go ahead and reset that there. Now, one of the last panes that I'm going to introduce you to is the sharpening pane as well as the tone curve. These are two of the more advanced options that you have in black and white, and we don't talk about them a lot when we're doing very basic introductions to how to use the program because they're not used very often. The sharpening pane is specific to people who are prepping their images for print or want to just crisp up the edges in a photo. A lot of people prefer to sharpen in other programs, or they have they like to sharpen right before they print. So if they're going through Photoshop and they like to add a Photoshop high pass layer for their sharpening, you can go through and you can do that. If you want to sharpen in here, just turn the pane on. We have 3 different types of sharpening: high pass, progressive, and unsharp mask. Progressive is one that we actually went through and we created ourselves. It's a general algorithm and it works really well if you don't know how to sharpen or you've never really done it before. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can take a look at it actually doing its magic here. Sharpening is meant to take an image that, when it gets printed out, looks a little hazy to look a little more crisp. With the progressive sharpening, there's one slider, the amount slider. You either move it to the left to remove sharpening, or you move it to the right to increase sharpening. Be careful how far you go. I typically keep this below 50. You only want to sharpen a very, very, very little bit on your image, because if you go overboard, you're going to get these weird halos. And this will happen with pretty much all types of sharpening. They're not just, it's not there to take an out of focus image and sharpen it. It's there to increase the crispness around the edges of your photo so that when you print it, it remains sharp. So try and do as little as possible to your photo, because the more you do, the more obvious it's going to be and the more fake your photo is going to look when you print it out. Now, there are 3 sliders here that are really important to note. You have protect darks, lights, and skin, so that you don't over sharpen any of the bright highlights, the dark shadows, or the skin tones in your image. So if we drop all of these down to 0, it's adding a little bit of sharpening around a lot of these strange areas on his face and around his jacket here. If I push the protect darks up, so that's really sharp. If I push the protect darks all the way over to where it needs to be, it's going to remove the sharpening from all of these darker shadows that are on his face and his jacket. This can be really helpful depending on the image that you're working on. For this photo, I would push the protect darks over quite a bit so that I don't over sharpen these darker shadows. I would also suggest using the protect skin when you're working on sharpening portraits, so that you can save the skin tone so that you're not over sharpening that as well. Now let's go ahead and turn that off there. The last pane that I want to talk to you about is the tone curve. This works very similarly to the way that you would access a curves layer in Photoshop or Elements. You also have a curve that you can access in other programs. I know that it's called different things. We call it a tone curve. Photoshop calls it curves. Elements, you can't actually find it. You have to go through something called color curves or color adjustments, and it does something slightly different. So everything has a different name for this, but it's the same idea. This is a graphic representation of the tones in your photo. The bottom left-hand corner are your blacks. The top right-hand corner are your highlights. This line straight down the middle gives you the ability to adjust different parts of your photo and whether you'd like them to be lighter or darker. So I'll go ahead and click on the center of the curve, and I'm going to click and drag, and you'll see it's just making the midtones and a lot of the, pretty much all of the image lighter. When I pull it down, it's going to make my image darker. However, you'll see that it's clinging to the highlights and the shadows to make sure that those don't get completely blown out. One of the things that can happen when you're working with just a basic thing like an exposure is when you make the entire image lighter, it's going to blow out a lot of those shadows. By using the tone curve, it will lighten up your image but try and save a lot of those darker shadows so that you still have contrast in your image. Now, if you go too far, obviously it's going to be crazy, but we've lightened the image quite a bit where the midtones are, and we still have these nice dark shadowy corners. One of the things that the tone curve is used the most for is adjusting the highlights and the shadows themselves. Nowadays, a very popular technique that you'll see is something called fading. Fading is, again, it's an old darkroom technique. That's where we steal all of the good stuff for digital editing, is real darkroom techniques. And you used to be able to fade the shadows of an image to give it this kind of antique quality. Now we call film antique, but back then they called many other things antique. So if you ever look at a lot of older images, they have these very faded shadows and their highlights look kind of dingy. We recreate that by adjusting the tones of the highlights and the shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this little dot on the bottom left-hand corner of the tone curve. And as I pull it up, it creates more of a grayish hue for the shadows than a black hue. And you'll see it adds this haze to the entire photo. As I move it all the way up, it's going to create a completely white image. So I'm going to pull that down and we'll add a little bit of a haze to the shadows. And I'll do the same thing for the highlights. I'll pull that down and I'll make those highlights a little bit darker. This is one of those strange things that some people love and other people hate. But I always like to show it because I think a lot of times it makes a little bit more sense when you're looking at the tone curve and you can actually view it in person. So for this image, I would probably lighten it just a little bit, and I might add a bit of detail and a bit of contrast to make sure that I have a bit of intensity to the image, and I would be good to go. Now, here inside Perfect Black and White, we have a ton of different presets. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to reset everything and start our image back from scratch. The Reset All button can be found in the Edit menu down at the bottom, and it will literally zero out every single slider adjustment you've made and change every single brush tool that you've made, so use that option very sparingly. Most of these panes have reset buttons to start you from scratch, so if you do something you don't like, you can click reset and it will bring you back to zero. So you have many different options for that. Now, before we talk about adding borders and textures, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about different presets for different images. This photo is pretty specific. I took this so that it would create a silhouette. I took it originally to be in color because I wanted that really intense, crazy fall hue that was happening. We don't get a lot of fall here in Oregon, so we try and capture it as much as possible. I took this photo intentionally to be a silhouette. And I intentionally also took it to be in color. And then the model requested that I bring it to him in black and white because he wanted that really cool, intense silhouette style. And so I transferred it, and I wanted to create a very high contrast image. We have everything separated down into each one of these different on-one preset categories. And the ones that I suggest you hit up the most are going to be whichever style of image you're looking for. So 19th century is going to respond with all of the different old school film looks, things like ambrotypes, cyanotypes, calotypes, all that kind of fun stuff. To go a little bit more modern, open up the 20th and 21st century. The 20th century classic silver, there are a ton of options in here that I think a lot of people forget about because we always end up talking about one preset. It's called Ansel in the Valley. It's a great landscape preset. It's a beautiful, high detail, high contrast, lightly toned look. And it is really, really crisp. I think most of the time when I'm editing landscapes, I start out with Ansel in the Valley because it's such a good starting point for an image. Let me scroll down a little bit so I can show you some of the others. One of the ones that I love and use quite regularly is something called High Key Fashion Normal. This is a high contrast, very, very bright option that can give you really blown out highlights and give you that really cool high fashion look. The other set of presets in here that are really useful that I think a lot of people never end up using are something called the Machinist presets. I'm going to go ahead and select one. These are high detail, but also high contrast with a lot of information in the shadows and the highlights. You'll see that not only does it add contrast, but it also increases shadow and highlight detail. It creates this very strange effect on the entire photo and is really, really, really cool. It also adds a specific type of, I believe, high pass sharpening or progressive sharpening, so that you get these really crisp edges, but you don't end up with these very strange halos around the edge. These are great for really intense studio portraits. I think everybody has probably seen a studio portrait taken of an athlete where everything, including like their sweat drops, are in focus. This would be the preset I would recommend you start with in that style of setting. Now, one of the other categories that I think kind of gets left behind is this one called High Speed Documentary. And it's a very special set. of presets, but again, with an image like this one, where I want that really cool, very intense silhouette, this is the category I would jump to. This one is called High Speed Low Drag, and it's one of the ones that I use for high contrast looks. It's an old vintage style, and it's one that is based off of an old 16 millimeter film type. If you ever shot real movie film in a 16 millimeter camera, if you shoot with a specific type of film with a filter on it, you get this really cool high contrast, very artsy style. It adds really, really, really intense blacks and really bright whites. It also applies a soft film grain to the image and a really intense vignette, so it's got this beautiful spotlight on it. This would be something I would probably use for this image, and I would just turn the film grain off because I don't necessarily like it for this photo. And again, this is one of those ones that a lot of people skip over, but ends up getting used. I end up using it quite a bit. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click apply here because I want to add this effect and bring you back into perfect layer so that I can show you, talk to you a little bit about a layered based workflow with black and white. You'll see on the right hand side in my layer stack, I have my perfect black and white layer over my original photo layer. One of the things about selective color that can be really frustrating is if you bring an image into black and white and you want to create selective color, it doesn't create a mask with your image. So I wouldn't be able to re-edit that selective color adjustment that I made. So if you want to be able to do that, I suggest applying a black and white layer and bringing yourself into perfect layers, because from here you can access the same masking tools. They're called something different, but it is the exact same icon that you saw inside black and white. So if I choose that masking brush and I select Paint Out, I can reveal the color from the original photo. And just like before, I can turn my perfect brush on and I can adjust all of those different options. But this time I get given a mask. Black and white is for the most part, outside of the brush tools, it is a global adjustment tool. It is meant to do everything all on one single layer so that it's easy to get in and out. However, when you want to do more advanced work like this, you want to access this layer stack. And from here, I can turn my perfect brush on, and just like we did before, I can go through and I can create my little mask. I can mask him so that he's all nice and shiny and in color, and everything in the background isn't. And I won't go through and do the entire mask for you, but you get the idea that you have access to this. Now, just like before, when we were working in black and white, you have the ability to view the mask. It's in the exact same spot as before on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And I can view my mask in red and I can see any holes that I may have accidentally missed here. If I mess up, I can do the same thing where I clicked the X key and we can remove the maple leaf right there so that it's out of the way. We'll go ahead and click that. Maybe we forgot an area that's right on the collar, so we'll go through and click over there to make sure we get all of that, and so on. So this is a little bit more of a versatile option if you're going to do something that's very intense, like we're looking at right now. This mask has to be perfect so that it doesn't look really weird. Now, alongside of the masking stuff is there's a border pane inside Perfect Black and White, and it's a really great place to do very basic borders, but it doesn't give you the ability to add textures or really get very creative with the borders that you apply. So again, just like before with the masking tools, I also suggest you do any of those excess edits in other programs. You can add borders as well as textures here in layers, or you can actually go over to Perfect Effects and do it. And that's what I recommend, is going over and applying borders and textures here. So inside Effects, when you add a border, I'm going to go ahead and apply a border. It adds in a very similar way as black and white does, except you have more options. And the one that's the most important is something called Fit Image. It gives you the ability to shrink a photo and make it fit so that you can see more of the entire image without thinning out the frame. So if I want a really big, thick white border, instead of just giving up and having to pull it out closer to the edge of the image, I can use that fit image slider and shrink my photo down until it fits into place. Now I can see almost my entire photo. I get this really nice border that I like, and I didn't compromise. Along with that, you also have the ability to change things like hue, saturation, and brightness of a texture, as well as more options with modes and opacity. So if we go through and we select an antique border, it doesn't really work for this image, does it? We're going to go through and we're going to select a sloppy border, and we go through and we choose one that we really like. We can adjust, yeah, we need a color border so I can actually show you how this works. So if you have a border that actually has color on it, you can change the hue of the border, the saturation of it, as well as the brightness. So if we want to increase or decrease the brightness of a border, we can do that. It only works with ones that have color information on them. So a lot of these are black, white, or a combination of either of those two options, but every once in a while you're going to get one that has a little bit of color information, and you can go through and you can choose how much color you want to be there. It goes the same for textures. If you want to apply a texture, I would do it here inside of effects, or do it inside perfect layers and add one of your own textures. Or you can use our extras manager, which you have access to inside perfect layers, and go through and add textures so that you can apply them here in effects. Usually when I'm doing textures and borders, I go into black and white and then effects all in one fell swoop, because it just makes the whole process go quicker. And I find it a lot more useful. What's also really nice, let's go through and I'm going to add a border here, or I'm going to add a texture. So let's add a paper texture. It's got this nice subtle warmish tone to it. We're going to decrease the opacity just a tad. We'll go ahead and click apply. When it gets applied, it's added as a separate layer. Just like before, that texture is added over the perfect black and white layer in my layer stack. And I can go through and I can do things like mask out the texture from parts of the image that I don't like. I can adjust things like the blending mode and how it changes with the image and so on. So being able to use this layer stack continuously is a lot easier when you're doing this more advanced editing side of things. Let's go ahead and click save. Because this is a PSD file, it's going to save all of the different layers inside of the layer stack, so I can still use the original, the black and white, and the perfect effects layer if I need to. So if I go back into this and let's say the client doesn't like the texture, they want it more of that intense, just straight silhouette, I can delete that layer and resave it and go from there. Now let's go ahead and close out of this. I was working outside of Lightroom earlier. The last kind of thing that I want to introduce you to is a little bit more of an intense portrait editing workflow. This is not really the best example of a portrait, because I'm working on an image of a man, and they usually require a lot less retouching than women do, which is a conversation for another time. Very different types of retouching there. So there wasn't a lot of retouching to this image. I didn't really need to do a lot of heavy other editing to this photo. It pretty much was adding some vibrancy and some intensity, and that was it. When you're working on closer up portraits, when you're doing images of high schoolers and doing like senior portraits or doing engagement shoots, and you have this more intense kind of facial image, you want to make sure that you do all of your portrait retouching before you bring it into black and white. Do not ever start out in black and white and then edit your image and do portrait retouching. The way the perfect portrait works is based on color identification and facial identification. And so retouching and trying to adjust in perfect portrait after you've created a black and white image is really, really annoying. So I've already gone through and I've done basic retouching to this image. That's pretty much all I'm going to need to do before I bring it into perfect black and white. So I don't really need to worry about that. Now this photo is a PSD file, so there's a little bit of layered based information in there, but I don't really need to worry about that. I can bring this into black and white as it is. When you're working on portraits and you're going through and you're applying different effects inside perfect black and white, there's a slightly different set of presets that you're going to want to pay attention to. The first are underneath the namesake category Hollywood Portrait. It makes a little bit more sense because it's a portrait-based category, but a lot of these apply a glow. We haven't really talked about glow yet. It's a very simple process. It adds a soft glow and haze to certain tones in your photo. And these are specific to the Bogart presets, which are higher detail, more intense, deeper blacks, and the Ingrid presets, which are a little bit brighter, also high contrast, but a softer, hazy kind of angel glow. I always use these as baselines when I'm working on especially wedding images. This is not a wedding image, but she has this like flower crown that's on, and she wanted this like vintagey Hollywood glamour style portrait, and so adding a soft glow would be perfect for that. One of the other ones is right up at the top, and it's called Ambrose, and it adds just this soft haze to the entire photo, and that can be really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Ingrid Neutral. You have Ingrid Cool and Ingrid Warm, so you can choose a tone for your image depending on what you'd like to do. I usually use neutral or warm. It adds this really intense, deep, dark black to the entire photo, and the glow pane has been turned on. Any of the changes that I want to make to this image, I can. One of the things that I do suggest when you're working on portraits is that you default the detail slider down to 0. If I move the detail slider too far over, it's going to add detail to some of the splotchier parts of her skin, and I've already gone through and paid attention to the fact that I wanted to decrease that. I don't want all of those splotches to pop up. That's when that detail brush on the left-hand side of your screen, you've got your little brush tools here, your brightness, contrast, and detail brush. Portraits are one of the main reasons why I love the detail brush. Global detail is not something I ever add. So I want to be able to go in and add detail to just the eyes or just the kick light that's on the right-hand side of her hair. So I went through and I zoomed in. I'm going to make sure that my amount is nice and high. And I'm just going to click and we're going to paint over her eyes. And I may go over a couple of times to really intensify it, especially on her irises there to really make them pop out. We'll go over her eyebrows a little bit too. We'll zoom out a tad and I may make my brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to drop the amount and turn that perfect brush off. And I'm just going to run the detail across the right-hand side of her hair there. And you'll see all those little tiny tendrils are starting to pop out a little bit more. And now she has these really intense, really, really bright eyes, this really beautiful kick light on her hair, but her skin is still nice and soft and has that very subtle, soft light glow on it. One of the other things that's really important about portraits is using the brightness brush because it gives you the ability to dodge and burn. Dodging and burning is something that was created in the darkroom, just like everything else that we do that's black and white based. And it was a way for you to selectively lighten and darken parts of your photos. And back in the days of the darkroom, people created all of these crazy tools and they would use their hands. And one of the reasons why Ansel Adams is as famous as he is because he was a master in the darkroom. He was a great photographer, but he was also way better in the darkroom than anyone had ever been. And he used all of these specialty tools, including the ability to dodge and burn, like no one you have ever seen before. So lightening and darkening selectively on a portrait is one of the ways that you can completely readjust the shape of someone's face. I've got my mode set to lighten right now, and I'm going to turn my perfect brush off because I want it to have this nice soft effect. I'm going to up my feathering amount by quite a bit. I want a really soft edged brush, and I'm going to drop the amount down. Now I can go through and I'm just going to kind of very casually lighten this area that's underneath her eye. We're going to brighten it up a little bit on both sides. And then we're also going to lighten up that strip right along her nose. We'll brighten that up a little bit. Very, very subtle changes, but we can go through and we can completely readjust how she looks. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to use this tool on a lot of these brighter highlights on the face so that we can really make her highlight parts pop out a little bit. And we can use this along, for instance, the hair if we want to brighten it up. So we can brighten up the kick light on the right-hand side. We'll go up a little bit more. Brighten up that kick light. We'll brighten up a lot of these darker areas on her chest to make it stand out a little bit more so that it's not quite so dark. And then we can do the opposite with our darken. And we can use this, for instance, to darken eyebrows and eyelashes and makeup to really intensify the eyes and make them look like they've got a little bit more contrast in there. This is good for darkening the lips as well if you want to make it look like their lipstick is a little bit darker. And that's always a really, really good option, especially when you're working on these kind of Hollywood glamour style portraits. And then we can also use that to kind of intensify some of the shadows on the body so that if you want to make things look like they have more definition than they may in real life, this would be a good option and a way for you to do that. So the brightness tools are extremely useful and can completely change the way someone's face looks, body looks, or how an image looks. And I always, always, always mention it when I do my advanced perfect effects webinars. And so when I do the perfect black and white webinars, I like to mention that that brightness brush is there. And it has the capabilities of doing a lot if you spend some time playing around and working with it.